Hello, this is Dr. Kevin Garrison with an 8th and final video lecture on writing and technology. So the first 6 video lectures define writing and technology and examine them from the perspective of substantivism and media ecology, which both argue that we create our tools and then our tools come back to create us. Both of those perspectives imply that we don't have a lot of control, that there's a lot of determinisms at play. And so we're spending a little bit of time here at the end of the semester grappling with this question of practice. What are we supposed to do to take back the control? The first thing we looked at in video lecture 7 was the idea of education. Children have a raw energy that we can tap into, a very positive, exciting energy. And if we stop beating them over the head with standardized tests and instead recognize that the metaphors that we use for knowledge impact the how we teach, and the how we teach impacts students more than what we teach, then hopefully we can tap into that raw energy and create a modest hope of recreating the future based on reteaching our youth. We're going to argue today for a second modest hope, and this modest hope is the words of Andrew Theinberg, and that is that technology should be user-centered. We'll grapple with what that means here in a second, but in general, let's talk about it from the big picture standpoint and then move down to the small picture. The big term in the 90s and the early 2000s was democratization. You see this with Andrew Theinberg's work, Questioning Technology, where he talks about democratized rationalization as a response to technology and technocracy. We see it in people who study technological determinism, such as Leo Marx. We see it in Langdon Winter in his 2 books on technology, where he looks at it from a political standpoint and argues that we need to take back control over technology by democratizing it and having that discussion at the local level. And then Becker and Pinch argue that there's a social construction of technology, that there is no determinism, that in fact we have some level of control by simply shaping the tomorrow by working on the today. Essentially what these all argue for in terms of this modest hope is that the individual or the user can work together with other individuals and other users with a very technophobic, critical response to technology to create then a democratic rationalization of the future of technique. In other words, we move from hard determinism to soft determinism by taking back some of the control that technology has taken away from us, all by generating the power of the user and the individual. To give you an example of this and how this works, I've chosen a quote from Men in Black, which is the movie that my wife and I came together over, actually. I put a quote in one of my papers from Men in Black, and she was in the class that I wrote that paper in. She read that, and she was very excited by that. The use of popular culture, right? But Tommy Lee Jones in that movie says, "A person is smart, people are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals, and you know it." So that taps into the mentality that we're grappling with here. Tackle the question of technology from the individual or the user standpoint rather than from the collective. A lot of people are doing this. The easiest way to think of it is in terms of anarchy or anarchist. Anarchy is simply a mentality from a political standpoint that looks at the people in power and the systems in power and says, no, I reject that, and start over with something that they create for themselves. Here's several different examples of that. Here's a simple one. Taking what we talked about last week in terms of education, a parent can tap into their child's creative energy quite better in theory than somebody in a school system teaching standardized tests can do. And so homeschooling taps into that. A parent as an individual possibly can be a better teacher than a public school educational system. Here's another example, off-the-grid thinking. We don't need the excesses and the consumption of energy that we currently have. So off-the-grid thinking allows us to take back control over that by just simply generating enough energy that we as individuals need rather than the collective. And you can see this in ecology movements, so it's for sustainability. You can see it in open source movements, which I have a friend on campus who's really big on that. And that taps in again to you don't have to use Apple, you don't have to use Microsoft, you don't have to use Android. You can, in fact, use things like Linux and use the open source created software that people have worked together on from an individual, decentralized, ground up movement rather than pushed down from a top down perspective. If we do this in theory, I'm going to give you several examples of this. If we do this, then in theory we take back some level of control. Here's a simple example. Andrew Fingberg talks about the house. He says if you're focusing on a house as a universal technology, then what you're looking at is contractors and architects and carpenters and plumbers, etc., all working together to create an efficient solution to this question of how is a person supposed to live. But a user doesn't think about it that way. They situate themselves in a local context. When I move into a building that I call a house, I turn that quickly into a home, not a house. And because of that, I want that house to be created with certain specifications in mind in terms of what my life or lived world experiences are going to be like. Here's some other examples. This is pulled out of Clay Spinuzzi's work tracing genres through organizations. The opening section from his first chapter gives a really good example of how individuals co-opt systems of technology. He says the following. He says, at a police station in the Midwest, a police officer named Barbara starts up the DOS-based database that she'll be using for locating and analyzing traffic accidents in a particular area. According to the software's manual, she should first unroll a 3-foot by 3-foot map. That's 3 feet by 3 feet. That's a pretty big map. Which is overlaid, the map is overlaid with 6-digit numerical coordinates called node numbers. That's a great word. Then she should look up the node number for each intersection she is investigating and type them one by one into a dialog box in this DOS-based database. The cumbersome map, obviously cumbersome, is rich in unnecessary detail, takes the entire space of a clear desk. It must be held down by paperweight so that it won't roll back up. And so it's no surprise that Barbara doesn't use it. Instead, she opens a folder and takes out a post-it note. Good old-fashioned simple post-it note on which she has written down a series of node numbers some months before, and the unwieldy node map is replaced by a conveniently sized note that holds only the details that she needs. This is an example of how a user takes back control in a very simplified way. I use a very, this is not really a high-tech, but it's still very technological. It's still paper colored with glue on it that allows me to take it off and post it somewhere, anywhere, in theory that that glue would work. So that's a user-generated solution to a complicated problem. I don't want to pull out a 3 by 3 foot map, unroll it, and put paperweights out on a clear deck. That's too complicated. So what I do instead is I just write down a few things and stick them on my computer screen, etc. So that's how users take back control. Here's another example. When my wife and I bought a cabin in New Mexico, it was off the grid, entirely off the grid. There was no water, no electricity, no septic. No heating systems. If you wanted to be warm up there, you either wore a coat or there was a passive solar heating system in the sense that the cabin faced the southern exposure, so the sun shone in during the morning and the afternoon and heated up the cabin. But otherwise, you just burn some firewood and do some other basic things to stay warm and to live up there. If you wanted to keep your food cold, you had to go into town and get ice, etc. I wanted to find a way to get electricity up there because I wanted to charge my cell phones and power a laptop and possibly put a little TV with a DVD player or something like that so we could watch movies while we're up there in a mountain-rich environment, a beautiful area. And so what I did was I created my own solution for that. This is, again, this sort of anarchist mentality. I could have easily just simply gone to Amazon and ordered a generator. That's pretty straightforward. But generators are loud and they're clunky and they're inefficient. And they make they create pollution and noise pollution, and I didn't want to have to drive into town and pick up gas every time I wanted to recharge it. So I was thinking solar electric would be better because it's quiet, but I didn't know anything about electricity, so I tapped into my father-in-law as a resource, who is an electrical engineer, and together we designed a system that is perfectly efficient for our needs. That we have a little battery that can be powered by one single solar panel, generating roughly about 500 watts of power each day, which is more than enough for running a TV at low light settings or for charging a cell phone, etc. What we have is set up so it runs into the controller then ties into the battery, and then the battery ties into the inverter, and then the inverter allows you to have 120 AC current. And so the point is that it's too easy to just go online and say, well, there's already a generated system out there that somebody else has constructed, this so-called universal technology that I can apply to my local context. Or what I can do is I can be an anarchist and contextually situate it and create my own solution to that problem. I'll give you one more final example. You'll see a new image up here on the wall back here. This is an image that my wife generated by being a big fan of Pinterest, which I'm not a big fan of, but she uses Pinterest to generate really cool ideas, and this is one of her most recent inventions. For Valentine's Day this year, she recorded her voice saying, "I love you, I love you," and printed that out and framed it and gave it to me for a Valentine's present. I, of course, did the ridiculous traditional thing of going and buying flowers. So what's cool about something like Pinterest is it taps into the fact that other people are creating cool, innovative solutions to these big, complicated problems of how do you show love to somebody on Valentine's Day that has become completely and utterly commercialized. How do you do that? Well, you tap into other people's ideas through a database like Pinterest, and you go through and pin certain things that you like and recreate that or replicate that in your local context so you can become an anarchist. Now, the person who is most important in technical communication in my field is Robert Johnson. He wouldn't call himself necessarily an anarchist, but this little orange book, User-Centered Technology, is, in my opinion, the most important book that's ever been written in technical communication. I call it the Little Orange Book. That's a nod to my former instructor, Dr. Joyce Carter, who called it the Little Orange Book. I love that. You don't see a lot of books with orange covers, and this one has that goofy appeal. Anyway, one of my colleagues asked me what is the most important book that's ever been written in technical communication. I said this book back in 1998, User-Centered Technology. His argument is not that complicated. Obviously he has a lot of nuances in his text, but it's not a complex argument. It's very simple, and it works like this. We looked at Knievey's rhetorical triangle last week in the previous lecture. This idea that when you're generating or creating a text, there are three nodes that have an impact on that, a power or epistemological impact on the construction of that text. So, for instance, you have the writer, the reader, and the reality, the three R's, right? If you take that model and you convert it into a technological system, then you get new nodes. And they look like this. You change the writer to the designer or the artist and the person who creates or generates, the technocrat, so to speak. If you change the reader to somebody who's not reading the text, but rather who's a user of an artifact or a technological system, then you have the word user here as opposed to reader. Instead of the word text, you replace it with the word artifact or the system. So you're creating a technological system or a technological artifact as opposed to a text. And then the reality has been replaced with this idea of user task or system action. Now, the most important thing that Robert Johnson does is that he relocalizes or reconceptualizes where the user is supposed to be in this equation. The system-centered view of technology implies that the most important aspect of this whole equation is the text, or in this case, the artifact, or the technology itself. And that the user is just simply a node out there that has some impact on that. But by reconceptualizing this and putting the user at the center, then what you have is this. You have the power of the user, the democratized rationalization power of the user being centered here and then working its way outward. so that this is a local individualized context for an individual user doing something, and it goes out to the next level of producing, learning, and doing within institutions, disciplines, or communities, creating ultimately culture and history. So it works its way out from the foundational point of the user. So it's a user-centered view of technology as opposed to a technology-centered view or a system-centered view. And it ultimately taps into this idea of the audience is the most important aspect of the rhetorical equation or the written equation. And so we're using this idea of communications or the idea of rhetoric to reconceptualize how we can think of technological systems. Problem is, it doesn't really work. It works on a big picture level in theory. It hasn't worked in reality or in practice. And here's why. Ultimately, in 2010, Johnson argued that user-centeredness had become so ubiquitous that it had become a quick answer to technological problems rather than being chosen with historical reflection and concomitant foresight. So in other words, the problem was that ultimately, if you're trying to create history, then perhaps it's important to put the history at the center of the equation and work toward that goal, as opposed to putting the user at the center of the equation and working out toward history. And here's why. Because when you start to think in terms of user-centeredness, then you start to think that the user is simply an important or necessary cog within the system, as opposed to something that can challenge the system. You're trying to tap into the user as technique, as opposed to the user as powerful. Here's an example of what that means. That's very abstract. Here's an example of how that works in reality. Consider usability. I teach a class called Usability Testing each semester, every spring semester at Angelo State. And these are some definitions of usability. Dumas and Reddish call it quickly and easily. How fast can I get from point A to point B in terms of time? And how easily can I accomplish a task? If you think about running a 100-meter dash, for instance, how fast can I get from point A to point B, and how many hurdles do I have to jump over on the process? Carol Barnum calls the love of products and invisibility. Invisibility meaning the interface just disappears. It's transparent. And then Jakob Nielsen says that the MEALS acronym, memorability, efficiency, errors, learnability, and satisfaction, and movement and Chesnell will say absence of frustration. Now what they've all tapped into here is this idea of efficiency. That ultimately, when a user enters into a technological system, such as here on campus, a student taking a class, or a professor logging into Ramport, or an employee using an email system, anytime you're entering into these technological questions, if you think about it from a usability standpoint, a user-centeredness, then what you're looking at is you're trying to create an efficient solution to an inefficient situation. How does that work? When you're designing an interface, you have one of two options. You can either create it from a system-centered view, and then at the end of it find out how the user liked it, and then make modifications and change it. You recognize that people aren't using the maps, so we get rid of them, and we create something that's more efficient for the user at that point. Or you can tap into user-centeredness and simply ask somebody what they want at the outset. What would you like? What would you use? A simple example of this at the local level is our recent change of Ramport at Angelo State University. Ramport is a hub where faculty, staff, and students can join together and have a database for things like registering for classes, or checking grades, or requesting transcripts and things of that nature. For years, they've had the same system, almost since I was a student here back in 2002 and 2003. And Ramport is a clunky interface historically. Now, a user-centered perspective would bring those people back into the equation, the faculty, staff, and students, and say, what would you like to see? What would you like to do? What do you do on a normal day-to-day basis when it comes to advising, registering for classes, teaching classes, etc.? And then build the system from the ground up with the user in mind. What they did is not that. They in fact redesigned it, beautified it, and made it more user-friendly. Here's an example. When I was at a focus group talking about Ramport, somebody said, what would you like to see in Rampart that would make you want to go there and stay? And I said, that is the wrong question. Nobody wants to go to Rampart and stay. They go to Rampart because they need to do something and they want to get out. And because of that, Rampart to some degree is an unnecessary interface. It's a hub that allows us to have access to our email. It's a hub that allows us to have access to the library. It's a hub that allows us to have access to Blackboard. It's a hub that allows us to register for classes. In fact, it's a completely unnecessary interface because I can go directly to my email by a web link. I can go directly to the library by a web link. And I don't have to log in twice to use these systems. So it's an extremely inefficient solution to a complex problem. And if they built it from the ground up, from a user-centered perspective, it becomes a usable system and one that taps into the power of users, but ultimately is a more efficient solution. Now here's where it gets goofy, is ultimately it's easy to subvert or co-opt user-centeredness not for the power of users, but rather to make simply things more efficient. And when we do that, we lose the power of the user in the end. So the last thing I want to suggest is this. If you haven't figured out already that I'm a huge fan of Jacques Ellul, if he was still alive today, he would be the one single individual on the planet that I would want to talk to, and I would not be able to because he spoke French. But his writings have always spoke to me on the deepest level. He argues a couple of things. First of all, this idea of think globally and act locally. That was his mantra. He was the first person to, at least in the research that I've found, the first person to use this idea, this adage, this slogan. And it means something very basic, right? We need to think globally. We need to think abstractly. We need to think philosophically. We need to think big picture. We need to have a 40,000-foot view of what is happening down here on the earth. You got to think big picture. But ultimately, that doesn't matter unless you act at the local level. Every decision that you have every moment of every day is simply a question of how you've chosen to act. So you can, when you walk out of a door, go left, or you can go right, or you can go straight. Most of us go the same direction every day. You can today decide whether or not you're going to walk to school, bike to school, drive to school, or do some variation of all of those techniques. You have those choices every single day. What am I going to eat? What am I going to wear? What am I going to read? Where am I going to go? What people am I going to talk to? You have to act locally at all moments. And in the process of acting locally, you then impact the systems in very small ways. So this is what Ellul says, and to me it's the most powerful writing that he's ever had. He says the following. This is 1990, right before he died in 1994. He says, above all things, we must avoid the mistake of thinking we are free. Read that again. Above all things, we must avoid the mistake of thinking we are free. He says, are we shut up, blocked, and chained by the inevitability of the technical system which is making us march like obedient automatons thanks to its bluff? Yet, we are radically determined. This is the key. He said, despite that, we profit. Let me read this slowly. We profit from the existence of little cracks of freedom. Let your head grapple with that metaphor for a second. That you've laid the concrete, it's solidified. We now have a concrete jungle that we call the city, this technological system that is crushing us, it's oppressing us, it's huge, we can't do anything about it. It's determined. But there's a crack that forms, a little fissure. And within that crack, what do you see? Life. A weed. Coming out of it. Flowering, blooming, creating itself. And he says, what do we have to do with these little cracks of freedom? He says, we have to install in them a trembling freedom, which is not attributed to or mediated by machines or politics. Think of that word trembling. A little vibration. We are creating the freedoms within that crack, making it grow, making it larger. Ultimately, why do we do this? Because it is truly effective so that we may truly invent the new thing for which humanity is waiting. We have to recognize that every moment of every day is a decision for how we are going to create the history of the planet, for the people in front of us. for the people who are our children. We make those decisions every moment. Now we can tackle that from a big picture standpoint. We can say that we need to tackle the system, that we need to tackle hard determinism, that we need to stop being autonomous, and we need to stop being in love with technology. We can argue for these things, but ultimately the only thing that we can hope for is that the individual, with his or her power, can tremble, can vibrate, to take that crack, those problems in the system, and make them grow. And you hope that somebody else will see it. I didn't realize I could bike to work today. I didn't realize that I could run. I didn't realize that I didn't have to take this medication. I didn't realize that there were other options for food, etc., etc. You just tremble, and other people will see that. And then hopefully, from a user-centered perspective, then technology can be changed rather than the system continuing to oppress us and crush us. So I'm done. Hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.